Sustainable development will be crucial to the long-term success of the Belt and Road, and this was a discussion that we had with Dr. Jackson Ewing, Senior Fellow of the Nicholas Institute and Associate Professor of the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. Our discussion ranged around the true meaning of green development, the establishment of coal-fired power plants in Pakistan, and the importance of the maritime ecosystems of the South China Sea. It was a great pleasure to speak to him.
I'm Jackson Ewing. I'm a senior fellow at the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions with an academic appointment at the Sanford School of Public Policy, both at Duke University. I formerly was a MacArthur Fellow at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore and a Director of Sustainability at the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York. I work on a number of issues related to environmental policy construction in the Asia Pacific. The three streams of work that keep me most busy right now are on carbon pricing and the potential for emissions trading system cooperation and potential linkage in the Asia Pacific, with focus primarily on Northeast Asian economies, Japan, China, and Korea, but expanding into South Asia to look at India's carbon pricing schemes, which are nascent but growing, as well as the spread of emissions trading systems in Southeast Asia. Also in Southeast Asia, I am exploring the ways in which environmental cooperation in the South China Sea could be a potential confidence building measure toward addressing the territorial boundary disputes there, as well as a key measure to protecting fragile ecological systems in that maritime environment, which are critical for the preservation of fisheries and other aquatic resources. And finally, with regard to the Belt and Road, my primary areas of interest are on environmental impact, but even more specifically on the future of investment into energy systems in recipient BRI countries, the dominance of coal within that investment calculus at present, and the possibility of scaling up investment into other non-coal energy systems in the future.
Thank you. Green development is a phrase thrown around a lot with regards to BRI. What exactly does it mean?
Green development means that one is accounting for environmental impact and potential secondary and tertiary environmental effects of investment systems, which I separate from impact in the sense that they can also encompass the future possibility of utilizing natural endowments and the possible impacts on things like public health, economic systems, etc., that transcend just natural environmental impacts as they're traditionally thought of. So in that accounting, a litany of different approaches can be taken. I think what unifies them under an umbrella of green development is that it is respective of a broader array of risk factors and a broader calculation of return and of the sorts of outcomes that you want to have from the energy and investment made into that development itself. For example, a green development approach to an energy system investment project on the BRI would account not only for the conventional pollution that would result from the creation of a power station, but also potentially the costs of the carbon emissions and the attendant impact on climatic changes both locally and globally. And through that I hate to use the word holistic because I find it to be a bit jargonistic, but through that more encompassing accounting of what the development impacts will be, you'll come up with different risk and return calculations as to what you should be investing in and how you should be pursuing that development. So I think that at its core, it's an alteration and an expansion of more traditional cost, risk, reward calculations that have defined development more traditionally.
That's a very good answer. If we can look and focus on some of the individual projects of the Belt and Road Initiative, there's been a wide array of their environmental and social impacts. Could you highlight an example of good practice and also bad practice, please?
Sure. So I think for the good practice, I'll begin there. We have seen a significant expansion into the investment in the sorts of alternative energy systems that I referenced a moment ago along the Belt and Road. It's often lost in the assessments of BRI investment because of the dominance of coal, but it should be noted that that investment from China into recipient Belt and Road countries on things like solar installations and wind-fired power, and in certain instances, non-conventionally renewable resources like nuclear or renewable resources that still require large engineering lifts like hydropower, are expanding. Those numbers are consistently growing, and we are seeing more kilowatt hours brought online in those systems quite steadily, and that is becoming one of the largest sources of investment for many countries in those sectors. Also, within the coal sector, there are examples such as a new hypercritical coal-fired power installation in Egypt that are being undertaken with Chinese investment that do reach to really the top threshold of environmental assessment and energy efficiency that's possible in the coal sector. And that's important because it will reduce the localized health impacts through the kind of end-of-pipe sorts of technologies that are applied to making sure that particulate matter from the coal-fired power plant isn't spewed indiscriminately, and also through greater efficiency, you'll be able to have more return from the energy you produce and therefore reduce your overall emissions footprint per unit of economic output. China is a world leader in those sorts of technologies at home. Unfortunately, and this is a good transition into the negative examples, it is often not exporting those sorts of highly environmentally attuned and efficient sorts of technologies abroad. And in fact, as the coal sector in particular is being squeezed domestically in China as part of its war on pollution and as part of its effort to peak coal-fired power production in the coming decade and ultimately scale up the use of other energy sources, that the coal sector is looking abroad, and it is increasingly developing coal-fired power systems in recipient BRI countries that are not utilizing the most modern technologies, are coming at the expense of investment in other sources of energy, and are utilizing the expertise, excess capacity, and in some cases even equipment from China for those old forms of energy production. To me, the most blatant and confronting example of this, without getting into individual projects, but on a country basis, is in Pakistan, where a coal-fired power sector has been funded and created largely out of thin air in the last decade, where one did not previously exist. This is not an expansion of an existing government policy or energy strategy. This is the creation of a new one, largely with Chinese support. And when we think about the impacts of that sort of investment, that sort of activity, I think they're difficult to overstate. We're looking at locking in decades worth of coal-fired power production. If we're making these investments in these large plants, the assumption is that there will be a return on that for up to 30 plus years into the future. The public health impacts of that for those countries through conventional pollution are well documented in other cases, and the emissions result with the global environmental challenges that attend that have almost exponential potential impact when we consider the size of some of these countries that we're talking about, the economic growth that they expect in the future years. These are not small places. Places like Pakistan, Indonesia, other previously investment into India, although that has been curtailed since. These are countries, in addition to the large population countries where China is investing in Africa, that are going to see the kind of exponential emissions and economic growth that will dominate the profiles of both of those categories globally in the decades to come. So when we consider what form of development that will take and what those emissions profiles will look like, Chinese investment becomes a really critical factor, and I would suggest we're a bit of a crossroads. While much has certainly already happened and is already taking place as we speak, the future trajectory of Chinese investment into these large population developing countries with really large development gaps that they are understandably determined to close is going to be, if not the most, certainly one of the most critical challenges toward meeting any kind of global climate change commitments, and certainly toward trying to ensure that these countries don't go through the sort of high pollution, high emissions phase that many other industrialized countries in the West went through in our own past.
Is there a distinction or variance between the environmental impacts of private companies and also official finance, may that be through SOEs in China or policy banks?
Well, yes, sure. I mean, policy banks have their own sets of standards on environmental impact assessment, and if a project developer, including an SOE, is going to accept finance from a policy bank, then the kind of going practice is, or multiple policy banks, it should be stated, that the going practice is that you have to meet the highest threshold of all of the investors for that given project on environmental impact assessment. So what that means is, if we're going to accept money as a project, if I'm a project developer and I want to accept finance from the China Development Bank or the China Exim Bank, then I will have to meet the standards that are higher between the two. If I go up that chain and I want to accept finance from the AIIB, then my standards are going to be still higher. And the AIIB largely tracks the conventionally Western, although global, financial sources like the World Bank, and is also, I think, on a peer level with the ADB, and often works in conjunction with those other multilateral development banks. So as we bring in different financing through those sources, the environmental impact calculus does change. In the absence of those sorts of high-level standards that could come with accepting AIIB or World Bank or ADB financing, which defines, and that absence defines a great deal of the BRI projects, the most important factor by leagues is the policies of the recipient country. And that there has, to my estimation, not been strong evidence that the project developers, SOE or otherwise, in these projects are consistently answering to anything beyond those recipient country standards, which vary significantly, and that is really the single most important factor in what the environmental impact ultimately will be.
Can there be any parallels drawn between Trump's embrace of fossil fuels recently and the continuing importance of fossil fuels close to the finance of the Chinese government?
It's a good question. First of all, I think it's worth stating that despite Trump's greatest efforts at a coal renaissance in the United States, as far as production goes, is not in the offing. And when we look at the decision-making processes of coal majors in the U.S., they are quite explicit about seeing a very high risk calculation for the development of new plants, not least of all because President Trump's administration will sunset long before the fruits of their investment come online if they were to begin planning, investing, and building a coal-fired power plant today. The CEO of a coal major in the United States once cited the prospect of President Elizabeth Warren in a somewhat flippant way, but I think an instructive way, as well as how they are considering, he and his colleagues are considering that risk calculation. So the time horizons between the U.S. electoral cycle and the planning for development in those sectors domestically in the U.S. are quite different. Now, the potential for exporting fossil fuel resources from the United States internationally is different than it has been at any point in the modern history of the country. The unconventional extraction of oil and gas and the continued extraction of coal has put the U.S. in a position where, while at this point they're relatively nascent and not at globally significant volumes, the U.S. is positioned to be an exporter of fossil fuels. And whether that offers some political space in the international diplomatic arenas for China to also be exporting those resources, or in their case, not the raw materials, but the infrastructure that can utilize those materials, is, I think, at this moment in time, something of an open question. I do not think that the Chinese authorities, when constructing the strategies that define BRI investment, had U.S. policies on energy export in mind, but the reality since those early days is that maybe there is more of a dovetail, and that I think it could become more difficult for critical voices in arenas like the G20, in the sustainable investment track of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, of other potential fora where we're discussing responsible investment and the need to curtail investment in traditional fuel sources in favor of the ideal fuel sources for the next generation. Those arguments might be more difficult to make from Western perspectives, or certainly from U.S. perspectives, without calls of hypocrisy if the U.S. continues on that track of real emphasis on fossil fuels as a continuing kind of primary energy source of the future.
Xi Jinping has often stated during some of his big statements, may that be the Belt and Road Forum or the 19th Party Congress, that China's Silk Road will be an environmentally friendly one. How can this be reconciled with its focus on energy-intensive industries? May that be shipbuilding, road construction, rail construction? Are these things reconcilable?
On a certain level, yes, I think they're reconcilable. Goods have to move. We should not let environmental impact arguments blind us to the reality of global commerce and the necessity of its continuation and, in fact, its expansion in many of these recipient countries. Roads, rail, and ships, to varying degrees and in varying circumstances, can all yield efficiency improvements that ultimately help these countries meet their development needs, which have to be kept at the forefront of our thinking, even when considering environmental impact, in ways that are more efficient than traditional or then I suppose in the absence of that sort of modern infrastructure, we can get greater connectivity between agricultural zones and urban markets, for example. We can get greater connectivity between manufacturing hubs and their destination markets around the world through these technologies and through these improvements in infrastructure. So I don't think that we can. I think that we do ourselves a disservice if we take too broad a brush in criticizing the development of transportation infrastructure in particular. And within that, even though the shipping industry certainly belches out emissions from the fossil fuels that are moving the ships across the oceans, it's at this moment in time the most efficient way to move goods, and in some cases even more environmentally efficient than what we might expect which would be a move towards much more localized modes of production. But that's a longer conversation. My main point is that I don't think it's justified to kind of throw all of this transportation under the bus, if I may use an unintentional pun there. With that said, though, I think site selection is vital. If we're talking about environmental impact assessment, the areas I'm most focused on in that are on emissions and public health and conventional pollution, but others who are emphasizing biodiversity and ecosystem services will be quick to point out that if you're going to build a railway from point A to point B, you're going to have multiple routes for doing so, and some will be through much more ecologically fragile or ecologically valuable areas, and that creates all sorts of different calculations around what your impact will be on biodiversity, what your impact will be, even if we want to more selfishly keep our emphasis on humans rather than other species, what your impact will be on a watershed that you want to continue to utilize or to maximize the utilization of, what your impact will be on other, sorts of critical ecosystems like a forest, which can protect that watershed, which can, try to combat the impacts that human populations in that area will ultimately feel from climate change, etc. So where you're putting this stuff and how you're constructing it and how intentional that is, and whether you're actually building transportation infrastructure that will maximize efficiency, that's really, to me, where environmental impact assessment becomes vital. And it's vital that it's robust and that it's undertaken in early phases of project design, and that it has teeth and is resourced in a way that it can be effectively operationalized.
Of course, there's strategic calculuses which come into the Belt and Road Initiative. I think, as Tom Miller stated, they expect to lose 70% of their investment along the CPEC corridor in Pakistan. But I think there's no dispute that finance and economics, financial return, is at the forefront of the Belt and Road Initiative. To what extent would not minimising the environmental and social impacts mitigate some of the returns which would hope to be seen from BRI? And sorry to interrupt, if I may just add a little extra bit to that. Are there any regions which are specifically vulnerable to not minimising environmental impacts?
So when we're looking at return on investment for China's Belt and Road Initiative, broadly put, I think that the most appropriate way to put ourselves in the position of the Chinese policymaker, rather than necessarily the companies that are doing the work, the people with the strategic vision that are driving the overall initiative, it's to not look at that return on necessarily a profit and loss project by project basis, because as your question implies, this is in many ways a strategic initiative in which China is prepared to take some losses and to have some defaulting on the finance that it provides. It is strategically to bring countries more into the Chinese orbit, But again, more to your question, economically, it is to try to enhance the markets that exist in those countries themselves so that they can become more vibrant and substantial economic partners of China in the future. And in that sense, it's a long play. It's about developing the future purchasers of the sorts of products that China would like to scale up its own production of, which are no longer meant to be the sort of lower skilled, more heavy manufacturing products like steel and cement for construction or textiles for consumer goods. It's going to be the tablets, smartphones, computers, IT infrastructure, even intellectual capital, biomedical, and of course China already has a presence in those industries. But this is the kind of a core element of its strategy, including dovetailing with the Made in China industrial policy, is to help build up these countries as future destination markets. And in that sense, it's not so different than some of the intentions of traditional Western aid, which one could argue have had a certain degree of altruistic objectives, but that also had the objectives of building up those sorts of relationships. So perhaps that's not so different than conventional development. As to what the environmental impacts are, again, I actually think that this is an area for putting forth an argument for a more comprehensive assessment of profit and loss that could resonate with some of the Chinese decision makers who are in position to influence what sort of environmental considerations and impact assessments the SOEs and, for that matter, private sector companies from China moving outward are utilizing. Because if we, to go back to the example of a coal-fired power station, and its expansion and domination of an energy market in a large country like Pakistan, this could have second and third order effects, such as massive expansions of the healthcare expenditures that country is required to make into the future, which will curtail its development, which will in turn reduce its ability to be a vibrant destination market for Chinese goods, at least on the level that it could have been, were some of those problems considered in the initial investment calculation. Now, this is a difficult ask to make. I think I would posit that it's an impossible ask to make of an SOE, or for that matter, a private sector company, who some will criticize as being myopically focused on their operational considerations. I disagree with that. I think they should be focused on their operational considerations, including profit and loss. It's up to the regulators in China and the regulators in the recipient country to establish the rules of the game. And so I don't look to the companies that are building the things along the BRI to change behavior in the absence of a nudge, a push, or a strict regulation by Chinese authorities or recipient country authorities. I look for shifts in those regulations. And I think that this kind of more comprehensive viewing of the strategic value of environmental considerations early on is a way to encourage that sort of regulation to be developed and to be taken seriously. China, in many ways, is doing this domestically. When we look at the massive expansion of regulation and the increasing degree to which it ties the political futures of provincial, municipal, and national leaders to environmental performance, this is an issue that it understands. But it is not pursuing a similar track internationally in its investments, at least not right now.
China continues to brand itself a developing country, even though it's getting close to the important threshold of $12,000 GDP per capita. What implications does it have to the way in which it can project itself by calling itself a developing country?
On a very base level, China's self-image as a developing country and a global power concurrently allows it to speak as a leading voice in international fora for the developing world. When we see China's activity as a leader in the G77, for example, in UN climate summits and elsewhere, that is something with real practical application as to what the ultimate agreements are reached on the different responsibilities that will be taken up by developing versus developed countries, etc. So by being a kind of a member of that caucus internationally, China is able to pursue and drive international dialogue and pursue international outcomes that are aligned with its own interests, and to, I think, solidify and deepen some relationships with the sorts of developing recipient countries that we're talking about in Asia and Africa that are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, is it potentially disingenuous for China to continue to promote that sort of self-image? Not necessarily. There's no doubt that, especially in central and western China, the development gap is still substantial, and that China understandably will tout that it has a long way to go. And it won't be the first country to strategically try to stay in that category. Singapore and South Korea have done similar things. These are smaller, less important countries geopolitically, but the idea that they are still developing is farcical. Yet, for various strategic reasons, in certain fora, they have continued to want to exist in that category. So, as to kind of beyond those diplomatic practicalities, does it matter? I'm not sure.
What can we do in the developed world, you as an academic, but me as a consumer, what can we do to help China take more steps to be environmentally friendly?
I think China deserves a lot of credit for much of what it's doing at home, and that there is space for some often fairly technocratic collaboration on how it continues to pursue policies, and as a person involved in public policy, that's my bailiwick, is to be involved in how those policies can be constructed, but others who are involved in engineering or energy systems development, etc., I think can also contribute to the way that China is designing those systems domestically. For example, my colleagues and I here are working with colleagues in China on its development of a national emissions trading system. Others are certainly involved in its historically scaled rollout of solar and wind power domestically, and the in combination the ways these varied policies can lead to stronger environmental outcomes, not only for the 1.4 billion people that live there, but because of the scale of Chinese emissions, and because of the scale of its economy, the global effects that all of those domestic policies will have. Internationally, I think it's more difficult. As a consumer, I think that a greater understanding on all of our behalfs on the kind of environmental footprint of the products we consume is always laudable, but that can be difficult to elicit, and everyone has to make their own decisions on how much energy they're going to put into that. As someone who's actively working on those issues, I think a sober look at what the levers of influence might be in trying to enhance environmental considerations and project formulation early on. And I put that into three categories. One is, and perhaps most importantly, recipient country policies. It's difficult to overstate how differently China acts as an investor and as a builder in different countries based on the policies of those countries themselves. And that doesn't just speak to environmental issues, it also speaks to labor distribution. It speaks to the terms of the different loans that might be provided to the country and the conditions that will define the working relationship of the infrastructure project as it moves forward, as to how much control will reside domestically versus how much control will reside in the builders from China, etc. All of these things vary significantly based on recipient country policies and the ability of those recipient countries to carry out those policies, from rule of law to corruption to the capacity to negotiate the agreements both in a private sector and in a diplomatic public sector setting. The second, I think, pillar or a stream of influence is with the Chinese authorities themselves. Is there a possibility to, through evidence-based analysis and convincing argumentation, lead to influential groups like the Exim Bank or the China Development Bank to revisit their standards for environmental impact and their practices surrounding it? Are there other creative ways to look towards the leadership of SOEs or outside of the kind of traditionally thought of primary players in this space? The major insurance providers, which one Chinese state-owned enterprise provides the vast majority of insurance for all Belt and Road Initiative projects, really for all Chinese and foreign investment projects. Is there a way to work with those sorts of players to enhance their engagement on these issues? And then the third stream is international. There are conversations that take place at the G20 around sustainable investing, around environmental impact considerations in the investment portfolios of different countries. Similarly, in the UNFCCC, there's a stream of negotiation that occurs that attempts to capture countries' behavior abroad, for lack of a better way to put it, and in international finance, as we see the Morgan Stanleys, the Goldman Sachses of the world become more concerned about stranded assets. In those two cases, move away from coal investment completely. Might there be the room in international financial fora and through, I guess, discourse on competition and on the potential for shared problems rippling through markets if these issues continue to be de-emphasized? Can that sort of process lead to some substantive change? Perhaps, but I think that it's certainly not we should pick this stream and work on it. I think that thinkers and people with practical objectives come into this with earnest and balanced intentions, and often are not vested in who any winners and losers will be personally, could add value in each of those different streams.
And as a final question, if you were going to summarize the Belt and Road Initiative in one word, and if you're able to, also one image, what would come to mind to you?
The word I would use is ambitious, and the image I would use is, well, let's do the map. As imperfect as some of the mapping on the Belt and Road may be, I can think of no greater visual accompaniment to talking about the great China dream that is this global investment or regional, potentially future global investment initiative. So the map.